May 2nd, 1957, outside the majestic apartments on Central Park West, Frank Costello, the reigning boss of what would later be called the Genovese crime family, steps out of a taxi and walks into the lobby. A stocky, heavy-set man in a dark coat steps out of the shadows behind him and calls out, "This is for you, Frank." A single shot is fired. It grazes Costello's scalp, drawing blood but missing anything vital. The doorman panics. The shooter turns and vanishes into the New York night before anyone can react. Costello survives. He never identifies his attacker to police, a silence that will define an entire code of conduct for decades to come. But the Nipt already has a name in mind. Vincent Gigante, a 29-year-old former boxer and Genovese enforcer known on the street as Chin. The nickname came from his mother, a diminutive of his name that stuck with him from childhood into adulthood. The case against him collapses in court when witnesses fail to identify him with certainty, and Gigante walks free. Costello, shaken by how close he came to death, quietly steps aside from power not long after. The man who pulled that trigger will spend the next 4 decades becoming one of the most feared and most misunderstood crime bosses in American history. To understand Vincent Gigante, you first have to understand Greenwich Village in the 1940s and 50s. Gigante was born there in 1928, one of 5 brothers raised by Italian immigrant parents in a cramped tenement south of Washington Square. 3 of those brothers would eventually follow him into the Genovese family, one of them earning a reputation of his own as a quiet, watchful capo. A 4th chose the opposite path entirely and became a Catholic priest, spending his life running housing programs in the Bronx instead of running crews on the street. Gigante himself started out as a professional boxer, fighting more than 20 bouts as a light heavyweight in the mid-1940s under a ring nickname built around his size. He won the majority of his fights, and for a brief window it looked as though he might make boxing his career. But the gyms of that era were themselves controlled by mob-connected managers, and Gigante's path from the ring to the street was almost seamless. He traded his gloves for a job as muscle, first running errands and collecting debts, then graduating into the kind of work that got a young man noticed by the men who actually ran the neighborhood. His entry into organized crime came through neighborhood connections and raw physical presence. He built a reputation as a dependable enforcer, someone who carried out orders without hesitation and without asking questions. That reputation caught the attention of Vito Genovese, the ambitious underboss looking to seize control of the family from Costello. The attempt on Costello's life is widely believed to have been ordered by Genovese himself, using Gigante as the instrument. The plan worked, at least at first. Genovese took control of the family that would carry his name. But his reign was short-lived. In 1959, he was convicted on federal narcotics charges and sent to prison, where he would die a decade later. Gigante, convicted alongside him in the same case, served 7 years. It was inside prison that Gigante's real education began. He studied how bosses fell, how wiretaps worked, how informants turned, and how the government built its cases. He absorbed a single lesson that would define the rest of his life. Visibility is vulnerability. By the late 1970s, Gigante had risen through the ranks as a capo, quietly building loyalty while avoiding the kind of public profile that had destroyed men like Genovese. In 1981, when boss Philip Lombardo stepped down due to failing health, he named Gigante as his successor while installing Anthony Fat Tony Salerno as a public front boss in the same move. A decoy meant to absorb law enforcement attention while the real chain of command stayed hidden. Instead of stepping into the spotlight the way John Gotti would a few years later with the Gambino family, holding press conferences on courthouse steps and courting tabloid headlines, Gigante went in the opposite direction entirely. This is where Gigante's most famous strategy began to take shape. Around this same period, he started appearing in public in a bathrobe and pajamas, unshaven, muttering incoherently to himself, wandering the streets of the village near his mother's apartment on Sullivan Street. Neighbors would see him standing on street corners at odd hours, sometimes soaked from rain, seemingly unaware of where he was. He was hospitalized repeatedly at psychiatric facilities where he presented as disoriented, confused, and unable to track basic conversation. Family members arranged for a rotating cast of doctors to build a documented medical history spanning years, complete with diagnoses of psychosis severe enough to raise doubts about his competency to stand trial. To the outside world, and eventually to federal prosecutors, Vincent Gigante looked less like the head of one of New York's 5 families and more like a homeless man in slow, irreversible decline. The press, once they caught on to the spectacle, gave him a nickname that would follow him to his grave: the Oddfather. Behind that performance, the Genovese family was operating with brutal efficiency. Estimates from the era put the family's annual revenue above $100 million, generated through construction rackets, labor union control, loan sharking, and gambling operations across the city. Gigante ran meetings in the back rooms of the same Sullivan Street social club he wandered outside of in his robe, switching in an instant from mumbling vagrant to sharp, calculating boss the moment the door closed behind him. Law enforcement was not fooled forever. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, the FBI built psychiatric assessments, informant testimony, and surveillance footage that told a very different story than the one Gigante's doctors presented. Bugs planted inside the Sullivan Street Social Club captured him speaking clearly, giving orders, weighing risks, and directing business with total command of detail. Agents watching from unmarked cars documented a pattern. Gigante would leave his mother's apartment shuffling and disoriented, walk the several blocks to the club, and the moment the door closed behind him, straighten up, change his tone completely, and run a meeting like any other boss in the city. Former associates began cracking under the pressure of the growing case. Soldier Vincent Fish Cafaro, a longtime Genovese loyalist, agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in the mid-1980s, describing in detail how the front boss arrangement worked and confirming that Gigante, not Salerno, held real authority over the family. His testimony, combined with the surveillance record, gave prosecutors the foundation they needed to finally move against a man who had spent 30 years staying one step ahead of exactly this moment. In 1990, Gigante was formally indicted, but years of legal maneuvering followed as his lawyers argued he was mentally unfit to stand trial. Competency hearings dragged on, filled with dueling psychiatrists, some hired by the defense insisting Gigante suffered from organic brain damage, others hired by the prosecution insisting his condition was staged from the very beginning. It took until 1997, 7 years after the initial indictment, for the case to finally reach a jury. At trial, prosecutors laid out 3 decades of evidence, Informant testimony, surveillance recordings, and a documented pattern of lucid criminal decision-making that directly contradicted the medical narrative built around him. Jurors watched footage of Gigante walking the streets in his robe juxtaposed against wiretap recordings of him coldly directing family business behind closed doors. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Among the charges was a conspiracy to murder Gambino boss John Gotti, a plot prosecutors said Gigante ordered because Gotti had gone around him and had Paul Castellano killed without the commission's approval. A breach of mob protocol that Gigante saw as a direct challenge to his authority. The jury agreed with the government on the racketeering and conspiracy charges. Gigante was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and fined $1.25 million. Even behind bars, the performance did not end immediately. In 2003, Gigante pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice after evidence showed he had continued directing family operations from prison, using relatives and associates during visits to relay orders, all while his legal team maintained in public filings that he remained incompetent. It was, by that point, one of the longest-running deceptions in the history of American organized crime. A con that had fooled doctors, judges, and journalists for the better part of 3 decades. Vincent Gigante died in the Federal Prison Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri on December 19, 2005, at the age of 77, reportedly of a heart attack in the very same facility where other aging mob bosses had died before him. He never lived to see the Genovese family the way the tabloids remembered him in his final years, not as a dangerous, calculating boss, but as the odd father, a punchline shuffling through the village in a bathrobe. But the men who worked under him and the federal agents who spent decades trying to prove what he really was understood the deeper truth. Gigante's greatest crime was never a single killing or a single racket. It was the decades-long illusion he built to survive in an era when every other major boss around him was falling to the exact same federal machine. While Gotti courted cameras outside the Ravenite social club and Castellano lived openly in a mansion on Staten Island, Gigante shuffled through Greenwich Village in slippers, avoided photographs, avoided interviews, and quietly outlasted almost all of them. His story is a reminder that in the world of organized crime, the men who survive the longest are rarely the loudest. They are the ones no one is watching, the ones who understand that the greatest power a boss can hold is the power to be underestimated. If you want more deep dives into the hidden world of the American Mafia, subscribe now and don't miss the next story.